On this episode of Eat Sleep Drive, I'm upgrading the fuel system of my 240, and I'm going to show you guys how to install a Walbro 255 fuel pump and some new fuel lines. What is going on, guys? It is another continuation of my LS swap for my S14, and this time it's all about the fuel system. So as you can imagine, the V8 that I'm dropping in here is going to need more power than the 4-cylinder that was in here. So I have a Walbro 255 fuel pump, which flows a lot more fuel than the stock one, and I also optionally have some new fuel line. So I imagine a lot of you guys doing a fuel pump upgrade for SRs and stuff will probably still use the stock fuel lines, but I'll show you how to do that towards the end if you're interested. A couple things I want to go over before we get this started is some of the part numbers that you're going to need for this job. So this will be pretty much applicable for the S13 and S14, but there's a few caveats. So the fuel pump is going to be one and the same. The fuel pump is GSS341255. The install kit is 400766, and I'll put all these links in the description. But this is like stuff that we're going to want to replace, like some seals and some hose. But if you're doing this, so all that applies to S13. If you're doing this with an S14, you're going to need an additional fuel pump kit. Now this is Walbro 400865. And what this is actually a different sock compared to the S13 sock. The S13 and S14 fuel pickup socks are different, so you're gonna need to get that additional one if you have an S14. So I wanted to get that out of the way, but let's jump into the install.
All right, so the first thing that we have to do is remove this carpet in the back here. So there are some push pins typically back here. My car doesn't have them because it's an it's a 240SX, and they're never complete, are they? Once you get that carpet out of the way, there are 4 10mm bolts that you have to remove. So I'm just going to remove those now. It's worth mentioning too that before we get started, it's always a good idea anytime you deal with anything electrical or fuel related to disconnect your battery. You don't want to be arcing anything back here with a live battery and then causing explosions. I also would recommend having a fire extinguisher on hand in case things get super out of hand. But it's a little disclaimer before we go any farther. So the next thing I'm going to do is just pry this up a little bit. There's just a little bit of a seal for it being on there for so long, and then you can pry these little tabs up as well that are holding the electrical lines in place. I brought you guys inside the car with me because it's like impossible to see from the other side, and it's actually pretty hard to get to this fuel pump area from the outside of the car. So I'm inside the car now. It's probably a better idea. But what we're gonna do is and there's 2 different plugs that plug into the fuel pump here. So I'm just gonna try and remove those first. There's 1, and there's 2. So now we can kind of get this out of the way a little bit. All right, now we have access to the top of the fuel pump where we have the feed and return, and then this is, I believe, the vent for the evap. So what I'm going to do now is remove these lines that are coming in and going away from the fuel pump, and I may cheat if these don't come off very easily, and I may cut these off with just a like a razor blade because I'm going to be replacing these anyways. But if you're going to be using the stock fuel lines, you'll obviously want to preserve them, so just get a pair of pliers or something. And of course they seem to all vary on this car. This first one comes off with pliers, and the other one looks like it is like a screwdriver worm clamp. So just go ahead and take these fuel lines off, and then we'll move on to the next step. S13 guys, you won't have to deal with this, but S14 guys, you will. On the S14, there's this sort of like screw cap on here to get access to the fuel pump. So if you're lucky, you can just spin this thing off, or if you're like He-Man or something. But if you're like me and you can't do that, you can take a flathead and then a hammer and just hammer this counterclockwise to try and get it loose. Doesn't take much effort. It started spinning already. So now this should be able to pull out. And actually get yourself a rag before you do this. So what you want to do, this is a lot easier on the S13, but on the S14, the hanger that the fuel pump sits in just kind of snaps in. So you kind of just got to reach in here, feel around, follow the hose, the fuel hose, and you'll hear it click, and then you can pull it out of that hanger. There we go. Here's that hanger mechanism I was talking about as I spill fuel everywhere. Now that I have this whole assembly out, what I'm going to want to do is deal with this outside the car. So I'm going to disconnect this fuel line and then disconnect these or this plug right here, so I can take the fuel pump assembly out of the car and then assemble it outside the car. I've laid all our old stuff and new stuff here. So this is obviously the new fuel pump. Here's the stock assembly. This is the hanger part I was telling you, kind of slides in there. You get a new hose that you will put here. And then here's the connector, which connects to the fuel pump that we're gonna have to splice into this plug right here. So that's kind of all the parts that they provided us. Obviously some hose clamps here. So the first thing I'm going to do is sort of disassemble this hanger assembly, get the fuel pump off, get this hose off, so we can fit our new stuff. Now I'm going to measure out roughly for this new plug. But now we'll be able to solder this plug together, so it'll go to our new fuel pump and this will go to the stock sending unit. Now I'm actually going to use the stock sock because this thing's in pretty good shape. It's not clogged or anything like that. So I'm not going to be using the one that came with the kit. If yours was in bad shape, torn or something like that, you'd want to use the one in the kit. But this one's a little longer than the one that came in the kit. But like I said, it's not too bad of shape. But anyways, you have to, in order to transfer this to the new pump, there's this sort of clip, which is like a one-time use clip on here holding this on. So I'm just going to take a pick and knock off these little tabs that are holding this clip on, and then it just comes off like that. So now that's off. I should be able to gently remove this sock, and there we go. Let us assemble the new fuel pump. So I trimmed this hose just a little bit because it was quite a bit longer than the stock one. I didn't think it was going to fit, but I'm going to put this hose on the fuel pump, and then I'm going to put a hose clamp on and tighten this down. Now we need to put our sock on. And then you're going to want to find your one-time use clip. And then I'm just going to try and push this on here. Clip is on, rubber grommet is on. Now it's time to jam this thing on this assembly. This is all on here now.
the shape of this rubber grommet on the bottom fits directly into the hanger itself, and I've tightened both these worm clamps down, so this is pretty secure in here. The sock is on. But before we finish up and do the wiring, I want to put 2 zip ties on here just to make sure it's fully secure and this thing doesn't wobble around at all. Make sure you put heat shrink on the wires before you solder them, and then we can head back in the car.
I'm going to reattach this hose, put a worm clamp on it. Now I can put the fuel pump back in. And you're just going to have to, when you take it out, pay attention to the way it goes in. Now that we've finally hung the fuel pump on that slot that it slides onto, you're going to want to inspect your O-ring on the top of the this cap here and make sure there's no cracks or tears or anything in this thing. Put this back on here gently. Now we can take the O-ring that we spun off in the beginning and put that sucker back on here. With the ring put on by hand as tight as you can go, you can tighten it up with your hammer, same method that you loosened it with. And then obviously if you were using the stock lines, you would just connect them up. If you're just doing the fuel pump, and you put those lines back on, all you have to do is connect these 2 wires, connect those lines, put those four bolts back, and you would be done. So if you are doing that, you are basically done with this video, and that is all she wrote. I'm going to continue on, and if you guys are interested, I'm going to show you how to put these fuel lines on.
If you're doing fuel lines, I'll warn you ahead of time, it's kind of a pain in the ass, just because these lines are really tucked up in there, and it's a lot of work to get them out. But the first thing that you're going to have to do is yank the existing lines, which is pretty straightforward. But before you just go yanking those fuel lines out, what I would recommend doing is, you see the string here? I tied that string to the both fuel lines that I ended up pulling down. That way when I go to bring my new fuel lines, I already have the string down here. You can see it right there, and that way it's going to be way easier for me just to feed those fuel lines up. So you can see my new ones are right there with the sort of like red caps on them, and like I said, the string method is, which I'm aptly naming it, is definitely going to save you some time. So let me take you under the car and show you where you have to feed these lines up. So here's my lines right here, and I'm just feeding them the same place that the stock ones went up. Excuse my camera work here, it's a little difficult under the car, but I'm just feeding them where the stock ones went up. So let's zoom out a little bit here, and yep, you can see them going up there, and it's just following along the where the stock lines were. So you gotta feed them up there, and then use the string method to bring them up, and that's what I'm gonna do now. So I've already fed these most of the way. I'm just gonna take one of these strings and wrap my electrical tape around the fuel hose and just pull the string out. So that's one of them. We do the other one. Let's see if this method works at all. I'm sort of afraid that I'm gonna pull the string straight out of the fuel line, so I have to check back and forth. Alright, this would be significantly easier with 2 people, because you sort of need to push on the fuel lines on the bottom, like feed it, while you're also pulling up top. Alright, check it out. I finally got these hoses up. So the string method is for sure the way to go. Have a buddy come and help you though. Have those strings tied to the ends and then have somebody feeding it from the bottom, because I just really had to go back and forth, and that's what I did. So I'm going to connect these up now. Remember to, before you feed these up, mark the feed and return line so you know which is which. We're under the car, and then the first thing I do, this kit comes with these clamps that clamp onto the hose, and then you tap into the rail. But before I do that, I'm just going to zip tie this up here loosely and just sort of mock it up. You could see down there, I just kind of have it up front generally where it's supposed to be, and I'm just going to mock it up with zip ties, and then I'll apply those clamps. Alright, my zip ties are in place, securing and holding up the line, and now I'm going to put in my first set of clamps here. And this is pretty much right before this split in the frame rail here. Alright, so this is how the fuel line ended up. Just got it zip tied up front. I have one clamp here, another clamp here, and then more zip ties holding it in the back. So she's all tucked next to the frame rail, so it should be protected. And now the only thing I need to do is go up front and run the fuel hose to the fuel filter in the engine bay.
This is going to be LS specific because this kit is from Sicky, and it's the fuel lines for the LS1 conversion. You got a feed and a return into the fuel filter, and then just one feed going from the fuel filter to the LS. So once again, LS specific, but what they say to do is to not put the fuel filter in this bracket down here, where I think there is one standard, to bring it up here, and there's some bolts up here you can see, and I'm just going to use the factory bolt and just drop that. But I have another one, so that's good. And I'm just gonna mount this here. So that is mounted up. Now the feed line actually goes to the outside of this fuel filter on this LS fuel filter, which actually I believe has a fuel pressure, has a FPR built in. So I'm just going to try and get this in a reasonable position here. That is the feed. The center one is the return. And then all I have to do is tighten these down. Alright guys, well that's all she wrote for the fuel pump and the fuel lines. Way bigger job than I expected. Took way longer than I expected. Not necessarily a difficult job, just a tedious job. The fuel pump in the S14 is in a very awkward place. And then the fuel lines take a lot of time, just run them exactly how you want them. But obviously well worth it when you need to get extra fuel to your engine like I do my LS. So thanks for watching guys. I hope you found this video helpful. I am going to have the links for the fuel pump parts that I use and referenced earlier in the description. So click the links in the description if you need to pick those up. And thanks for watching as always guys. We'll see you next time.